Yeah, one of the theories about the name Frango is that it was Frederick Nelson is the fur, and then Ango was capitalizing on the tango, which was a big deal in the 1920s.
Right.
There was one theory that it was at one time called the Franco, but they ditched that name.
That was the Spanish version.
Yes, exactly. They ditched it when the dictator came along.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS9 and Crosscut. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And today we're going to talk about food, specifically food that had its origins in the Northwest, and more specifically, an episode called Mossback Upon Further Review, The Short History of the Frango. If you haven't seen that video, we suggest you stop right now, go to the show notes or the show page on crosscut.com and check it out. We'll see you back here in a bit.
Frango is a delicious chocolate candy. It was invented in Seattle in 1918. This is chocolate before chocolate was like cool.
What was it about a little candy called Frangos that made you want to do an episode about it?
I know, that's so funny.
Seems not the biggest thing about the Northwest.
Well, yeah, I don't know whether I'm the proper judge of that. We did an episode on foods that became famous or originated in Seattle, and we looked at a bunch of them: Belgian waffles, Dutch babies. Chicken teriyaki is a fast food. We talk about these foods and we have a plate of each one there, and I'm eating it, and the kind of eating you don't want your cardiologist to witness. That's really good. I didn't even put mustard or ketchup on this thing. Well, we've had a lot to eat. We need to top it off with a treat, a locally made treat, the Frango. And at the end of the episode, I say, well, I think I'm going to top this off with a Frango. And I pull out this little chocolate candy that has a wrapping on it. Now, I didn't even eat the candy. I just kind of held it up. And I got so much mail, like emails flooding in about Frangos. And people wanted to know more about them. People wanted to know their history. People had memories of eating Frangos. The Frango was developed by, it's a chocolate mint truffle, and it was developed by sort of one of the premier department stores of Seattle, Frederick Nelson.
Sure.
And it just had a place, I guess, in people's hearts and stomachs. And people want to know who invented the Frango. So when we came up with the idea of occasionally doing episodes called Upon Further Review, the idea was that we would elaborate on an episode where we had new information, we had to correct information.
Oh, so you got a lot of information from viewers about Frangos.
Frangos, yes. And I, discovered there was a book written about Frangos, was a lot about Frangos. And it also had a personal connection because I ate Frangos all my childhood and into my adult life. I gave Frangos, I bought Frangos. So, it was a local confection that was very famous, purveyed through Frederick Nelson, which had department stores elsewhere. And then later, after Frederick's folded, the Bon Marché sold Frangos, and then when Macy's bought the Bon, they sold Frangos. But Frangos are no longer available in a local department store. That's gone away.
It strikes me that Frangos was just part of this nostalgia about the department store experience. And the department store, for me, was a destination. It was a downtown destination, and it had everything. It was sort of a minor Disneyland. And so the Frango is couched in those memories.
Oh, I think you're right. I mean, You think about those old department stores, and not only did they sell everything and multi-floors of, clothes, toys. Frederick's had a lending library, but they also had restaurants in them, tea rooms. This is where the Frango developed as a frozen dessert in the Frederick Nelson tea room, which is the thing where ladies went to be seen and to see fashion shows. And it was, a very social thing. And so, and to me, a lot of the stories that we do, because they're Northwest stories, my family has been here a while. I have local connections with them. And when I think of Frederick Nelson, I think of my grandmother, my granny.
Really?
Yeah.
Did she take you to Frederick Nelson's, or was it part of her life?
Oh, yes. It was a huge part of her life. When I came along, she had been widowed. Her husband had a fair amount of money. She was comfortable. They had built a little home in the Mount Baker neighborhood. And she was, from a Scottish fishing village and, had emigrated. And she loved to go shopping. And she didn't drive, so she would walk across the street, get on the 10 Mount Baker bus, take it downtown, get out at the department stores. And when I think about every holiday, every Christmas, she had the tea cart that would be laden, and everything was from Frederick's. Little mint cookies, nuts, bowls of nuts. Sometimes we kids would be given, the Frederick and Nelson had chicken pot pies that came in these little ceramic bowls. And then after you ate the pie and washed the bowl, your mother would keep it, and it would be a cereal bowl. So all of our cereal bowls were these Frederick and Nelson green chicken pot pie bowls. But for her, she had friends and social contacts and everything. But Frederick and Nelson, I think she went there almost every day. I think she would, have her big purse, and she would get on the bus and go down there and come home with something.
Well, I can understand for a lot of people who weren't working every day would really enjoy this sort of retail church, as it were, that just had so many experiences inside it. Certainly during the holidays when everything was decked out, I remember going to the Crescent in Spokane, which was Spokane's equivalent of Frederick and Nelson, so much so I thought it was owned by Frederick and Nelson's. But you'd go there were cafes, there were displays, there was a lot of shopping. You could go to any floor and find things. And it was a place you could go to dinner, to see things and be seen, and feel part of the city. So I can imagine that well.
Yeah, was there a doorman?
I'm sure there was.
Yeah, that was one of the things that Frederick and Nelson was a big deal, was there was a uniformed doorman, so if you drove up in your cab or your car, or you needed help loading all your packages. I think there was a sense of urbaneness, or, that the department store was sophistication itself. It was service. It was... And it wasn't all high end. That's the thing. You could buy a box of Frangos for 50 cents in the old days. They advertised it. So it was accessible to a lot of people, but everybody, it was in that era where people dressed up to go downtown. Your mother made you put on a jacket or a tie and if you were going to someplace like Frederick and Nelson, you were sort of expected to look proper. I think for Seattle, which was, had the reputation of being, Skid Row was, something people knew about. We were a seaport. We were provincial, stuck up in the corner. This was our New York, our little bit of elegance. And, they manufactured their own candies. This wasn't stuff they were selling from other vendors. Their food, they had kind of a deli area and a bakery, and then they had a candy factory right there in the building.
So it was all manufactured, all made right in the Frederick and Nelson building.
In the building, yeah, in the building. And, and they made a bunch of different flavors of these Frangos. But a Frango, if you didn't know what to get somebody for their birthday, or even if you did, or for Christmas, or as a going-away present, or as a thank you, what did you do? You bought a kind of, a box, a little box of these chocolate mints.
What was it about Frango, the candy itself, the taste, what was it about it that captured so many people's appetites?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, it was basically chocolate mint, right? And eventually they manufactured variants of it very early on. And so the mistake I made in that little short Frango segment was I said they were invented in 1918. That's not true. The candy didn't really show up until about 1927, 1928. But the name Frango, somebody trademarked it back in like 1918. But I think these truffles, the chocolate was kind of exotic, and they were using peppermint oil from Oregon, so there was kind of a local, thing to it. And they were just kind of enormously delicious. And then they began experimenting with flavors. So they had a rum flavored one. They had a hazelnut one. They tried different flavors, and then as time went on, they added even more. They had an ebony Frango, which was milk chocolate on the inside and dark chocolate on the outside. And so they always kind of kept you coming back for sort of the latest iteration. Were they better than other candies? Tastes vary. I mean, there's certainly nowadays Seattle has no shortage of candy companies.
But it's so unusual, I think, for a particular candy or brand to be so attractive to so many people. I mean, you wouldn't find anybody who does not like Frangos.
Yeah, apparently,
which I don't think you could say about some other
candies
that we will talk about coming
That's
up.
True. That's true.
Was the name Frango? It seems like it's an attempt at an acronym. Where did the name come from, or was it?
That's a subject of
pure marketing
debate.
And advertising effort.
Well, there was a frozen dessert called a Frango before Frederick Nelson was serving it, and the flavor was usually orange or maple, and it was made with very high fat content, like 30+% fat content, and it wasn't really ice cream, and but it was more crystalline than that, and people said that it would stick to the roof of your mouth. Now later, Frango made ice cream that I remember it as just really good ice cream. So that was sort of the original confection that had the name Frango, and Frederick Nelson served, I guess, really good Frango in the tea room. And then they hired a guy to run their candy shop, and he's the one that made the truffle, and they switched the name to the truffle.
Yeah, just F-R-A-N, sort of like Frederick and...
Yeah, one of the theories about the name Frango is that it was Frederick Nelson is the fur, and then Ango was capitalizing on the tango, which was a big deal in the 1920s.
Right.
And there was one theory that it was at one time called the Franco, but they ditched that name.
That was the Spanish version.
Yes, exactly. They ditched it when the dictator came along. I think it was just adopting a pre-existing dessert name for their candy. And they apparently hired a guy whose name escapes me at the moment, but they hired a guy who was a brilliant promoter. So in Frederick Nelson's sort of heyday in the sort of 20s and 30s and 40s, this guy just promoted the heck out of the Frango. The other thing that happened was Frederick Nelson ended up getting bought by Marshall Field in Chicago, And they liked the Frango so much and saw how popular it was that they have their own version in Chicago. So if you grew up in Chicago and your mom or dad were shopping at Marshall Field, you're familiar with the Frango. But their Frangos, are slightly smaller and they're not individually wrapped and they don't come in the kind of octagonal box that became so well known here. Yeah.
Right.
Everybody remembers the shape of the box.
So where does one get Frangos now?
Well, up until a few years ago, you could go down to Macy's downtown, which was in the old Barn Marché building, and they actually had a whole Frango shop right there on. But they left town. They went out of business. And so somebody else bought the right to sell Frangos. I think you can find them online. You can find the Marshall Field ones online. They're as close as you can get to the old Frederick Nelson Frango if you really want one.
So Frangos were one thing that everybody remembers. What about other sort of regional sweet memories, food memories? What was another one? Now, of course, applets and cotlets comes to mind.
Yes.
But that's sort of for some reason, it's for me, it seems like really hyped, but nobody really liked it that much.
Yeah, well, it's funny because a few years ago, there was it was announced that applets and cotlets, they're produced in Kashmir, Washington. And if you go there, there's actually like an applets and cotlets way, you've got a street. And there's a little factory there where they make them, and you can tour it, and you can buy. Yeah, and I've been there as well. And, they're sort of a Turkish delight style confection, powdered sugar over a kind of jellied and a nut flavored thing. And, I used to hate them. My grandmother always had, on her tea cart with all the other treats, there was always a plate with applets and cotlets, and usually they were stale. And I think it was one of those things where it was kind of like a gift that you could give. It was, and but when the applets and cotlets was threatened with closure, people went nuts. People were really upset. There were big articles about it. And eventually somebody came along and saved applets and cotlets. So it's still going, and you can still get them, whether you like them or not. And they made grapelets, and they also made chocolate-covered applets and cotlets. Every time I have written in the newsletter or anything mentioning a dessert, it just is like pushing the send me mail button. The subject of Nanaimo bars came up recently in my newsletter, and I was deluged with memories of Nanaimo bars, people both on this side of the border, Canadian side of the border. Now, Nanaimo bars, not everybody knows what they are, but they're basically, it sort of has a baked crust, but it's sort of a refrigerator fudge. You have a crust on the bottom. You have custard in the middle, and then a layer of thick chocolate, dark chocolate on top. And they apparently originated in the town of Nanaimo on Vancouver Island. And I guess the earliest references to them are in the early 1950s. And they're, like anything else, they're desserts that are really similar that other places make. But Nanaimo bars, I think they became very famous in Canada. People, they were sort of like the Frangos of British Columbia.
Souvenir food.
Yes, exactly. But also, Nanaimo is one of those places that's on the stop if you're cruising the Canadian San Juans, if you're going to Alaska, if you know people from Seattle who have a sailboat and go up, that kind of thing. They're introduced to this Nanaimo bar when they get up there, and then they come back. It's easy to make. It's the kind of thing you could find the recipe in Sunset Magazine or the Seattle Times or whatever. But people, it turns out they have huge debates about what the best Nanaimo bar is, what kind of custard to use. people feel very strongly, but there's a lot of like regional identity tied up in it.
Well, I found whenever anyone, I don't think I've ever had one, but when anybody mentions Nanaimo bars, the reaction of most people is, just, real gusto.
They're really good.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, they're really good. I had a gluten-free Nanaimo bar where I just had a bite of one, and it was fabulous, So, I get it.
What about almond roca? Is that an exclusively Northwest
That's local.
deal?
Tacoma, Brown and Haley. There's even a little, funny little shop there in Tacoma near the Tacoma Dome that sells, that's the almond roca outlet. And, my mother was a huge almond roca fan. I mean, every Christmas, it was the surefire. She expected it, and she liked the tin.
Of course. Had a kind of a Victorian presentation in a tin.
Yeah, they're wrapped in gold foil.
Right.
And apparently one of their secrets to success, I heard this back like in the 80s, was the Asian market. That the colors of pink and gold, which are sort of the colors of the tin, were considered auspicious in parts of Asia. And they became a kind of go-to gift for occasions. And so they were shipping and selling tons of almond roca overseas. And of course, you can get them in Bartell's or any place now. But, they represent this kind of, little bit of elegance in a candy tin that just, people, I guess once you get addicted to them, you just never want to see them go away.
What's the one food that took off in the Northwest that is sort of the least likely suspect?
Oh, I think the story of chicken teriyaki as a fast food is sort of one of the most kind of unexpected things.
That seems very unexpected.
Right. Yeah. And there's been a bunch of research done on it. A lot of writers have written about this, an article in the New York Times and other places. And, a man named Toshi Kasahara came up with, not far from where we're recording this near Seattle Center, opened a teriyaki place. And, sweet sauces like teriyaki sauce have existed, for a long time. But he was the one that sort of put together the combination of fast food, which was, grilled chicken, teriyaki sauce, a little green salad, and a big pile of rice in your, styrofoam container. And it turned into a big Seattle thing.
So it wasn't the actual recipe, it was how he packaged it. He packaged it as nutritious, I guess, fast food.
Yes.
In a clamshell.
Yes. And his restaurant became very popular. He opened other teriyaki places. Other people imitated it. And it just became this sort of go-to fast food, and it spread to other cities. But Seattle was sort of the main place where, for a time, and we're talking in the 70s and 80s, you didn't go to McDonald's drive-in. You went to a Toshi's. Teriyaki was everywhere. It was more prevalent than your traditional fast food places in terms of it's in small neighborhoods, it's in big neighborhoods, it's on Aurora, it's... they're everywhere. Very cheap to get into as a business. And, of course, most strip malls have parking. So you just zip in, get your takeout and run. And it's super fast. And so when I was at Seattle Weekly, where I was editor for a while, we had a writer who did an article on the kind of history of chicken teriyaki, which is one of the places that surfaced a lot of this story. And then later, I was quoted in the New York Times saying something about about chicken teriyaki, and I got a call from Anthony Bourdain's producer, and they said, "We're coming out to Seattle, and we're interested in doing a segment on chicken teriyaki. And would you be willing to be interviewed for that? So we come out and talk to you about that." And so we got together at a teriyaki place in Fremont. It's so interesting because, it used to be chicken teriyaki, and Toshi's was the kind of, cookie cutter, the model for it. And, of course, nowadays, a lot of the places, they serve Chinese food, they serve Philippine food, they serve Mexican food. I mean, you can find like every combination, and they're everywhere. And we talked about chicken teriyaki. They decided not to do a chicken teriyaki segment, but we ended up doing a segment about we ended up doing a segment that turned out to be sort of about serial killers. But we did it at a Taylor Shellfish, where, we did the classic thing where we feasted on a platter of Dungeness crab, oysters, and, all the, the glorious seafood, and talked about these dark topics that Anthony Bourdain wanted to talk about.
Well, speaking about seafood, one delicious bit that I know is exclusive to our area is the Olympia oyster.
Yes, right. We did a whole episode on Olympia oysters because, first of all, it's the only native oyster to this region.
That's right.
Up and down the West Coast.
That's right. And it's tiny.
Yeah.
It's very small, but every other oyster you see is Japanese
That's right, from somewhere else. Yeah. And, and I mean, the oyster business is huge here. Originally, it was huge based on these native oysters that, had been here growing for years. And, of course, indigenous people had been eating them for a long time. But when, settlers got here, it was, a really terrific food. That old slogan, when the tide is out, the table is set. Well, when the tide went out, you'd see these huge oyster beds full of these tiny little oysters. Some of them weren't so tiny because I went out to the Burke Museum and found an Olympia oyster shell. And it filled the palm of my hand. Most of them are sort of maybe the size of a quarter.
Right, and kind of roundish, not oblong.
Yes, and this one was roundish, but it was bigger than a dollar coin, much bigger.
They're very slow growing, right?
Yes, very slow growing, and they're delicious. And there was a huge appetite for them. The shellfish industry was like even before timber, exporting shellfish, and was a really big deal. And so they were exporting these shellfish, sending them to San Francisco where they could arrive by boat and still be fresh, still be alive in the shell. Now, Olympia oysters are, there's some places that raise them. And I just heard recently from a company out in Oysterville that is growing Olympia oysters. They're not seeding them, but they're growing them in a natural bed. They're free-range oysters. They're wild Olympia oysters out there. And I thought that was super intriguing.
What is it about food that culturally that informs our history?
I think this was something Anthony Bourdain, going back to him, he understood, which was food is place. Food and place. And if you want to get to know a culture, you go eat their food, and you learn a lot right there. And place and food and history are just so intertwined. It's this fundamental human activity. And in a place like the Pacific Northwest, we're food rich. You have this amazing abundance of seafood that was accessible. You had fertile lowlands where farms and dairy could flourish. Apple orchards, fruit, berries. There's nothing more symbolic of the region than salmon, and it's because of the food it provided, the way it sustained cultures and sustained people for millennia. And we mentioned this in the episode about the Frango. There's the whole connection between taste and memory that, if you see a landmark, it can spark, a 1,000 words of memory. If you eat a Madeleine, or you eat something that you grew up eating but haven't eaten for a while, or you remember an association between food and family and memory, these things are just very powerful. And they're kind of a kind of connective tissue. Now, in the previous episode, I made the mistake of not eating a Frango, but this time we're not going to make that same mistake. So, Stephen.
Somebody's already been in there.
Unlock the memory banks.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. This episode was produced by Seth Halloran, and the executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. If you'd like to check out more videos from Mossback's Northwest, you can find them all at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. The video series is now in its 7th season. A new episode airs on Seattle's PBS station, KCTS9, every week through May. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. For more on all things Mossback, go to crosscut.com/Mossback. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the live events we host every month, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of KCTS9. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly newsletter from Knute Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.